Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. Try to imagine a world in which there is nothing human. Nothing at all. No cities, of course, that much is clear, but also no villages, no fields plowed and sown, no roads, not even the most primitive footpaths worn down by feet, no bridges across rivers, no signs that a human had ever lived here. Because he does not exist yet, he has not yet appeared, or is only just appearing, taking his first steps across this planet that has already existed for billions of years without him, and was doing perfectly fine. It must be said, it is difficult to imagine, truly, because we are used to humans being everywhere, to the traces of human activity being all around, even in the wildest places and jungles, in deserts, in mountains everywhere, you can find something that points to the presence of people, at least in the past. Some artifacts, the remains of fires, shards of tools. But then, in the very beginning, when the first humans appeared, or rather, the first human-like creatures we can call our ancestors, the world was completely different. Wild in a sense that we cannot fully understand now. Let us try to transport ourselves there, to that moment, and see what the earth looked like, what grew there, what lived there, what the climate was like, what the dangers were, and most importantly, how those creatures, who would later become humans, as we know them now, survived in this world. This time is called the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, and it lasted incredibly long by human standards, from roughly 2.5 million years ago until 10,000 BC, that is, more than 2 million years. Can you imagine how long a period that is? Our entire written history, all the civilizations we know, Egypt, Rome, all of that would fit into a tiny sliver of this time, and the rest, the vast, endless rest, is the Paleolithic, a time when people lived in caves, hunted with stone tools, knew no agriculture, knew no metal, lived as part of nature without rising above it. Africa, the cradle of humanity. What was it like? We shall start with Africa, because it is there, according to all modern data, that the first humans appeared, or rather, the first hominids, creatures that walked on two legs, had enlarged brains compared to apes, and used primitive tools. Africa at that time, say, 2 million years ago, was not like it is now. The climate was different. The landscapes were different. The Sahara, for example, which is now a vast desert, was not a desert then. There were savannahs, forests, lakes, rivers. Life was teeming. And it was in this environment, on the border of the forest and the savannah, that our ancestors appeared. Why exactly there, on that border? Because the forest provided shelter, food, and trees to climb in case of danger, and the savannah provided a view, the ability to see far, to notice prey, to spot predators from a distance, and creatures that could use the advantages of both zones had a better chance of survival. Imagine the savannah, boundless as far as the eye can see. The grass is tall, in places taller than a human, swaying in the wind, yellow-green and dry in the dry season, green and succulent in the rainy season, and scattered among this grass are trees, acacias with flat crowns, thick and ancient baobabs, sometimes groups of trees forming small groves, islands of shade in a sea of grass. The sky overhead is vast and blue, the clouds white and fluffy, drifting slowly. The sun is hot and merciless, especially at noon when it stands directly overhead and there is almost no shadow. The heat is such that the air shimmers and warps, and it seems as if the earth is melting. The horizon is distant and blurred. On it, mountains are visible, low, rounded, covered in vegetation or plateaus, steep and reddish from laterite, that iron-rich soil characteristic of the tropics. The sounds of the savannah are unique. During the day, it is the chirping of insects, an endless, loud ringing in the ears, the harsh, shrill cries of birds. Somewhere in the distance is the roar of a lion, low and resonant, making the heart clench. or the laughter of hyenas, eerie, sounding like human cackling, but with something inhuman and frightening. In the evening, when the sun sets red and enormous, painting the sky in orange and violet tones, the savannah comes alive in a different way. The time of predators begins, the time of the hunt, and then the sounds change. They become more wary, more anxious, because night in the savannah is dangerous. Very dangerous for those who do not know how to protect themselves. In this savannah lived our ancestors Australopithecines at first, then early Homo habilis, the handyman Homo erectus, the upright man, and they were not the masters of this world, by no means. They were one of many species trying to survive, and survival was difficult, a daily struggle. Their groups were small, perhaps 20-30 individuals, family groups where everyone knew each other, where there were leaders, strong males who protected the group, and females who gave birth to children and cared for them. The elderly were rare, because reaching old age was difficult. Most died young from disease, from predators, from hunger. They walked on two legs. This was their main advantage. Their hands were free, they could carry children, they could carry food, they could use sticks and stones as weapons and tools, and this provided a chance. A small one, but a chance. They did not look exactly like us, of course. Their height was smaller, 1 m 1 m 44 Australopithecines, slightly taller for early Homo. Their build was sturdy and muscular, because life demanded physical strength. The weak did not survive. Their faces were different. Jaws were massive and protruding. The forehead was sloped, brow ridges were thick. The nose was wide and flat. Eyes were large, dark, and wary, always watching, because danger could come from anywhere. Skin was dark, almost black, protection from the sun, from ultraviolet light. The hair on the head was short and curly. There was more hair on the body than on modern humans, but less than on apes. Something in between. There was no clothing at all. The body was its own natural protection. The skin grew coarse in the sun and wind. It became thick, almost like the skin of a rhinoceros. A joke, of course, but truly. They were adapted to life without clothes. In a hot climate, this was not a problem. They ate a varied diet, not just meat, as is sometimes thought. Meat was a rarity, a delicacy. It had to be obtained by killing an animal or driving predators away from their kill. Carrying an that was dangerous. It required courage, coordination, and group interaction. More often they ate plant foods, roots and tubers dug up with digging sticks, fruits when they found them, berries, seeds, nuts, the leaves of certain plants, insects, termites, of which there were many. They caught them with sticks, inserting them into termite mounds. The termites would cling to the stick, and they could be licked off. Pure, nutritious protein. They also ate bird eggs if they found nests. Honey from wild bees, sweet and energetic, but obtaining it was difficult. The bees stunk. They had to use smoke to drive them away, and they didn't always succeed. They drank water from rivers, lakes, and puddles after the rain. There was enough water in the rainy season, but in the dry season it became a rarity. They had to know the places where water was always present, watering holes, and these places were dangerous, because everyone went there, both herbivores and predators, and an encounter with a predator at a watering hole could be one's last. They slept on the ground, in the grass, under trees if they found a suitable spot protected from the wind and, as much as possible, from predators. They huddled together, warming each other, because the nights could be cold, especially in the dry season. The temperature dropped, and without fur, without fire, they had to seek warmth from one another. They did not know fire, did not know it at all. That was later, much later. The first Australopithecines and early Homo habilis did not use fire. They saw it, of course, when lightning struck a tree, when savanna fire started in the dry season and the fire moved like a wall, devouring grass, trees, and animals that failed to run away. And it was terrifying. Fire was a force of nature, uncontrollable, dangerous, and they ran from it like everyone else. Later, Perhaps 1 million years ago, maybe a bit earlier, Homo erectus learned to use fire. First they found natural fire smoldering embers after a forest fire, and they learned to maintain it, feeding it with dry grass and branches, carrying it with them, guarding it, and not letting it go out. And this was a revolution, a huge step forward. Fire provided warmth, allowed survival in a colder climate, provided light at night, scared off predators who feared the flames, and made it possible to cook food. Meat cooked over a fire was easier to chew, easier to digest, and provided more energy, and the brain, which requires a lot of energy, could grow and develop. But that was later. In the very beginning there was no fire, and the nights were dark and full of dangers. Survival depended on the ability to hide, the ability to be inconspicuous and quiet, and, in many ways, on luck, the animals that lived nearby and those that were to be feared. Africa at that time was full of animals of incredible diversity and size, and many of them were enormous compared to modern ones. This was the time of megafauna, giant animals, most of which would later go extinct, and humans would play their part in this, but that would be later. There were elephants, of course, but not like now. They were larger, mastodons with huge, curved tusks that could reach 30 full meters in length. They grazed in the savannas in herds, slow, powerful, and dangerous. If angered, they could kill a human with a single blow of the trunk or crush them. Giraffes were tall and long-necked, browsing leaves from the very top branches of acacias inaccessible to others, and their height allowed them to see predators from afar. They were a kind of sentry of the savanna, and other animals watched them. If the giraffes grew alert, it meant danger was near. Rhinoceroses were massive, with thick hides and a horn on the nose, aggressive, especially females with young. They could attack without warning, charging at enormous speeds, and it was best to stay far away from them. Hippos lived in the rivers and lakes. During the day, they were in the water. Escaping the heat at night, they came out onto the bank to graze, and they were dangerous, very dangerous. Despite their fat, clumsy appearance, hippos killed more people than many predators. Their mouths are huge, their tusks like daggers, and if one found themselves between a hippo and the water, when it was returning in the morning, it might attack to protect its path. Zebras grazed in herds, striped, beautiful, and fast. They were prey for predators, and our ancestors could sometimes drive a predator away from a killed zebra to take part of the meat. This was a dangerous strategy, but sometimes it worked. Antelopes of various kinds, gazelles, impalers, wildebeest, thousands of them, tens of thousands grazed in the savannas, especially during migrations, when they moved in vast herds in search of fresh grass. Following the rains, and the earth trembled under their hooves, dust stood like a column, and visibility dropped to a few meters. Buffaloes. African buffaloes are among the most dangerous animals, unpredictable, aggressive, with huge, curved, sharp horns. They lived in herds and protected each other. Even lions did not always dare to attack adult buffaloes, only the young, the sick, or those that had wandered off. And predators, of course, a multitude of predators. Lions, big and powerful. Prides of lions controlled territories and hunted in groups, and their roar at night was a sound that made everyone hide, freeze, and hope that the hunt would pass them by. Leopards were loners, secretive. They hunted at twilight and dawn, dragging their prey up trees so other predators wouldn't take it. And an encounter with a leopard was deadly. They could attack suddenly from an ambush, killing quickly and silently. Cheetahs were the fastest. They hunted during the day, choosing a victim and chasing it down, reaching speeds of up to 100 kilometers per hour. And the antelope they pursued rarely escaped. But cheetahs were not as dangerous to our ancestors. They preferred small game and kept their distance from humans, even primitive ones. Hyenas, spotted hyenas. They were scavengers, but not only that. They also hunted in packs themselves. Their jaws are so strong that they could crunch through bone, and they howled at night, laughing with their eerie laughter. And if a pack of hyenas found a wounded animal or a group of people, small and weak. They could attack. Saber-toothed cats still lived at that time, though they were gradually becoming extinct. Huge cats with fangs, as long as sabers protruding from the upper jaw. They hunted large prey, mastodons and rhinoceroses, and for a human, an encounter with a saber-toothed cat meant death almost for certain. Crocodiles in the rivers. Huge Nile crocodiles. They could reach 6 to 7 meters in length. They lay in the water motionless, looking like logs, and when a victim approached the water to drink, the crocodile attacked with lightning speed, grabbed them, dragged them under the water, drowned them, and resistance was useless. Snakes, venomous ones and constrictors. Pythons that could suffocate a person by wrapping their body around them, and the bite of a venomous snake, a black mamba or a cobra, was fatal. Without an antidote, which did not exist, a person died in agony within a few hours, sometimes minutes. Scorpions, venomous spiders, insects carrying diseases, malaria, sleeping sickness. All of this was part of the environment, and mortality was high, very high. Most children did not survive to adulthood, dying from diseases, accidents, or predators. Tools first. How were they made? Why? One of the main differences between our ancestors and other animals was the use of tools, and not just accidental use, as some apes do, using a stick to get termites, but systematic, purposeful tool making, shaping stone into a desired form, creating a tool for a specific task. The first tools were primitive. They were simply stones that were split with another stone, creating a sharp edge, a cutting edge. And such stones are called all-down tools, named after the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where they were found in large quantities. It sounds simple, split a stone, but it required an understanding of the stone's properties, the ability to choose the right stone, and to strike it correctly to get the desired shape. And not everyone could do it. This was knowledge that was passed on. They learned from each other. The young watched how the elders did it and tried to repeat it. Why were these sharp stones needed? For cutting. For butchering animal carcasses when they found a dead animal, or when they managed to kill something. They needed to cut through thick hide and separate meat from bones. And it was difficult to do this with teeth. Our teeth are not adapted for this. Not like a predator's. But a sharp stone cut easily and quickly. Also, stones were used for digging up roots and tubers. A digging stick was also a tool, but a stone could make it more effective, sharpen the end, make it harder. Over time, tools became more complex. Hand axes appeared. Oval stones worked on both sides, with a symmetrical shape. They required more effort to make, more strikes, and more precision. And these hand axes were used for various tasks. For cutting, for chopping, for digging. A universal tool. This was slow progress, very slow. The shape of all-down tools did not change for hundreds of thousands of years. Can you imagine? For hundreds of thousands of years, the same tools, the same way of making them. Because there was no reason to change. It worked, it was enough for survival. And only when conditions changed, when new challenges and new opportunities appeared, did tools become more complex. The climate changed. Ice ages began. The world of that time was not stable. The climate changed, and these changes were dramatic, affecting all living things, plants, animals, and humans, forcing them to adapt or go extinct. Ice ages began when the temperature across the planet dropped, and glaciers advanced from the poles, covering vast territories of Europe, North America, Asia, and even in Africa, which was not covered in ice. The climate changed, becoming drier and colder. Savannahs expanded, forests shrank, and animals migrated, following food and water. And our ancestors also had to move, seeking new territories and new sources of food. Between the ice ages were interglacials, warm periods when the glaciers retreated. The climate became milder and wetter. Forests returned, and life flourished again. But these were cycles, long ones, tens of thousands of years, and each cycle was an ordeal. Many scientists believe that it was precisely these climatic changes that stimulated human evolution, forcing them to be flexible, adaptive, to use their brains, and to invent new ways of surviving, because those who could not adapt died out, while those who could passed on their genes. Migrations from Africa. How people spread across the planet. For a long time, our ancestors lived only in Africa. This was their home, their world. But about 2 million years ago, maybe a bit later, Homo erectus began to leave Africa, migrating to other parts of the world, and this was the beginning of the human settlement of the planet. Why did they leave? Perhaps the climate changed, and they needed to find new territories. Perhaps the population grew, and Africa became crowded. Perhaps it was just curiosity, a desire to find out what was beyond the horizon. We do not know for sure, but they went. The first migrations were to Asia, across the Sinai Peninsula, which then connected Africa with Asia, or across southern Arabia, when the sea level was lower and crossing was possible. And groups of Homo erectus moved slowly over generations, a few kilometers per generation, perhaps following animals, rivers, and food. They reached the Caucasus, the territory of modern Georgia. Remains aged about 1.8 million years have been found there. They reached China and Indonesia, where the remains of Java man, Pithecanthropus, as they used to be called, were found on the island of Java. These are all Homo erectus, having spread over vast distances. Humans came to Europe later, perhaps 1 million years ago, maybe a bit earlier. The climate in Europe was colder, and adaptations were needed. Fire was needed, clothing was needed, and the first Europeans were brave, because the world they entered was harsh. In each new territory, they encountered new animals, new plants, and a new climate, and they had to learn all over again what could be eaten, what was dangerous, where to find water, and where to find shelter. And many groups probably perished, unable to cope, but others survived, adapted, and the population grew. Europe of the Ice Age. Mammoths and caves. Europe during the Ice Age was a world of ice and cold. Huge glaciers covered Scandinavia and descended to the territory of modern Germany and Poland. And south of the glaciers was tundra treeless, with permafrost, a short summer, and a long dark winter. Still further south, on the territory of modern France and Spain, were steppes cold steppes, not like the African savannahs. It was cold here even in summer, and in winter. Frosts reached -30 to 40 degrees, and snow lay for months. Mammoths grazed in these steppes, huge, covered in thick fur, with long curved tusks. They dug through the snow with powerful legs, reaching the grass and shrubs that grew under the ice. And their herds moved across the steppes like living mountains. Woolly rhinoceroses were also there, covered in long fur with two horns, one large, one smaller. They were loners, sullen and dangerous, and hunting them was difficult. Reindeer. Large herds of reindeer migrated across the tundra and steppes, and they were the main prey for the people of that time, the Neanderthals who lived in Europe, and later the Cro-Magnons, Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors. Bison. Cave lions larger than modern lions. Cave bears, huge bears that lived in caves and hibernated in winter, and an encounter with a cave bear in its cave was deadly. They were territorial and aggressive. Cave hyenas, wolves, wolverines, foxes. All these predators competed for prey, for the carcasses of killed animals, and humans were part of this competition. Not the strongest part, it must be said, but smart, capable of using tools, fire and group coordination. Humans in Europe lived in caves. When a suitable one was found, the cave provided shelter from the cold, the wind, and predators. One could build a fire at the entrance, and the heat stayed inside. One could sleep more or less safely, knowing that a predator would not sneak up unnoticed. But caves were not everywhere, and when they weren't, people built shelters, simple ones made of mammoth bones and hides stretched over a frame of bones, or branches if trees were nearby. And these shelters were wretched, it must be admitted, but they worked. They held heat, protected from the wind, and it was better than nothing. better than sleeping in the open air at -30. Clothing was a necessity, an absolute necessity in such a climate, and people learned how to make it. Sewing together animal hides with bone needles they carved from bone, making holes with stone drills. This took time, patience, and skill, but the result was worth it, because without clothing in the European Ice Age, a person would die in a few hours. Hides first had to be processed, cleaned of remnants of meat and fat with stone scrapers, and kneaded so they became soft and did not harden in the frost. And this was long work that everyone did, both men and women, because clothing was a matter of life and death. They wore trousers sewn from hides, tunics, capes, and footwear made of fur. All of this was crudely sewn but functional and warming. And when the remains of ancient people are found in the permafrost, their clothing is sometimes preserved, and we can see how skillfully they knew how to sew using only stone and bone tools. Hunting a mammoth was an event, not a daily activity, but something special, requiring preparation, planning, and the participation of the whole group, perhaps even several groups together. Because a mammoth was huge and dangerous, and it was impossible to kill one alone, they chose a victim, usually a young mammoth separated from the herd, or an old, sick, or weak one, and drove it toward a cliff, a swamp, or a pit that they might have dug in advance and camouflaged with branches and grass. And when the mammoth fell in, they attacked it with spears and javelins, threw stones, shouted, and frightened it to keep it from getting out. The death of a mammoth could take hours. It was long and cruel by our standards, but they had no choice. They had no weapons capable of killing quickly or instantly, only numerous wounds, blood loss, and exhaustion. And in the end, the mammoth fell and died, and the butchering began. Butchering a mammoth was a job for everyone. Men cut the thick hide with stone knives and separated the meat in huge chunks. Women and children helped, carrying the meat back to the camp. Everything had to be done quickly, before predators arrived, drawn by the scent of blood, and before the meat began to spoil. From a single mammoth, one could obtain tons of meat, enough to feed a group for months if properly preserved, frozen, smoked, or dried. And this was a time for feasting and celebration, because such luck was rare, and it was necessary to celebrate and thank the spirits, the ancestors, and the forces of nature that allowed it to happen. Mammoth bones were used for building dwellings. A framework was made from the large bones. Ribs were dug into the ground in a circle, and skulls and tusks were placed on top, covered with hides and sod. The result was a sturdy, warm dwelling capable of withstanding winter winds and snowfalls. Tusks were used for making tools, weapons, and jewelry. Ivory is easily worked. It was carved into figurines, statuettes, spearheads, needles, and awls. It was a precious material, and every part of the mammoth was used. Nothing was thrown away. Mammoth fat was burned for light in primitive lamps made from hollowed-out stone, where the fat and a wick made of moss or grass were placed. Such a lamp burned for hours, providing light and a bit of warmth. This was vital during the long winter nights, when darkness fell early, around 3 or 4 p.m., and lasted until 8 or 9 a.m. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, the meeting of two human species. In Europe, when our ancestors, Homo sapiens, often called Cro-Magnons, arrived, other humans were already living there. Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, who had appeared in Europe earlier, about 300,000 years ago, and were perfectly adapted to the cold climate. Neanderthals were sturdy and muscular, with massive bones, broad shoulders, and short limbs, which helped retain heat. Their brains were large, even larger than those of Homo sapiens on average. They were intelligent, used complex tools and fire, and buried their dead, which indicates the presence of symbolic thinking and perhaps the seeds of religion. When Homo sapiens arrived in Europe roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, a period of coexistence between the two human species began. This was a unique situation in history because they competed for the same resources, hunted the same animals, and lived in the same caves. Did they meet? Of course they did. Archaeological finds show that their camps were sometimes close together, in the same valleys, and by the same rivers. Contact was inevitable. We do not know exactly what happened during these meetings. There are no written sources, only indirect evidence. Scientists debate whether these encounters were peaceful or hostile, whether they traded or exchanged technologies, or if they simply avoided each other and kept their distance. GENETAC research shows that interbreeding occurred. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had children together. In the genomes of modern humans, except for those of sub-Saharan African descent, there is a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, about 13%, which means that somewhere, at some time, our ancestors and Neanderthals met not only as enemies, but as partners. But overall, the relationship was likely tense. Competition for resources was fierce, especially in the harsh climate of the Ice Age, where every piece of meat, every cave, and every successful hunting ground counted. Conflicts were inevitable. Gradually, over several thousand years, the Neanderthals disappeared and went extinct. Their last populations lived in the south of Spain, in Gibraltar, about 28,000 years ago, and then they were gone. The reasons for their extinction are still discussed today. Perhaps Homo sapiens was a more efficient hunter or more flexible in adaptation. Perhaps climatic changes hit the Neanderthals harder. Perhaps diseases brought by Homo sapiens killed them, as happened later to Native Americans after the arrival of Europeans. Or perhaps, more likely, a combination of all these factors led to their disappearance. Whatever the case, the Neanderthals vanished, and Homo sapiens remained, becoming the only human species on the planet. This was the beginning of the end for many other species, because Homo sapiens turned out to be an incredibly successful predator, capable of hunting any animal in any climate, with increasingly sophisticated tools and strategies. Art appears, cave paintings and figurines. Somewhere around 40,000 years ago, perhaps a bit earlier, something remarkable happened. People began to create art. Not functional objects or survival tools, but things intended for beauty, for expressing something internal, or for communicating with the spiritual world. Perhaps the first works of art we find are cave paintings. These are images of animals on cave walls, made with charcoal, ochre, and mineral pigments with amazing skill, an understanding of anatomy and movement, and an attempt to convey not just the animal's form, but its spirit and essence. The Lascaux caves in France, Altamira in Spain, Chauvet, and many other caves across Europe are decorated with these drawings. When modern people first discovered them in the 19th and 20th centuries, they could not believe they were made by primitive humans. It seemed too perfect, too beautiful for savages. But it was indeed them, our ancestors, who lived in caves, hunted mammoths, and yet found the time, desire, and need to draw and create beauty. This suggests they were not such savages after all. They had a rich inner life, emotions, thoughts, and aspiration that went beyond simple survival. Why did they draw? We can only guess. Perhaps it was hunting magic, drawing the animal to gain power over it, so the hunt would be successful. Perhaps they were rituals or shamanic practices. Perhaps it was simply a desire to capture the beauty of the world around them, to leave a mark, to say, I was here, I saw this, I felt this. Besides drawings, they made figurines, small figures from stone, bone, or ivory. The most famous of these are the so-called Venuses, female figurines with exaggerated forms, large breasts, wide hips, and rounded bellies, without detailed facial features, emphasizing fertility and motherhood. The Venus of Willendorf, found in Austria, the Venus of Lausel from France. Dozens of similar figurines have been found across Europe, dating from 30,000 to 20,000 years ago. Their purpose is also a mystery. Perhaps they were idols or fertility goddesses that were worshipped. Perhaps they were talismans carried for protection or help in childbirth. Or perhaps they were simply depictions of female beauty from a time when fullness was a sign of health, prosperity, and the ability to carry and give birth to healthy children. Musical instruments also appeared during this time. Flutes made from bird bones or mammoth tusks with drilled holes. These flutes could produce melodic sounds, and we know this because modern musicians have tried to replicate them and play them. It turned out work music can be extracted simple, but real. This means our ancestors sang, danced, played instruments, gathered around a fire on long winter evenings, and shared not only food but stories, songs, and rituals. This made their groups more cohesive and better able to survive hardships, because culture, art, and ritual bind people together more strongly than just a joint hunt. Languages developed, communication became more complex. Language had been with humans for a long time. The capacity for speech likely developed hundreds of thousands of years ago. Perhaps even Homo erectus had some form of primitive speech, but by the time we are discussing the late Paleolithic, language was already fully developed and complex, with grammar, syntax, and a large vocabulary. Anatomically, the structure of the larynx, the position of the tongue, and the shape of the skull in Homo sapiens allowed for the production of the wide range of sounds necessary for speech. Archaeological finds the shape of the hyoid bone, the size and shape of the canals in the skull for the nerves controlling the tongue, and lips all point to the fact that our ancestors, 40,000 years ago, could speak just as well as we do. Each group had its own language or dialect. The isolation of groups from one another and the distances separating them meant that languages diverged quickly, becoming incomprehensible to neighboring groups after just a few generations. This created linguistic diversity, a vast number of languages spoken by small groups of people scattered across the world. Communication within the group was constant and intense. People told each other about what they saw on the hunt, where they found edible plants, and where danger lurked, sharing knowledge and experience. This accumulation and transmission of information through language was one of the primary advantages of Homo sapiens over other species. Stories were told, myths were created, and explanations of the world were formed. Why does the sun rise and set? Where does the rain come from? What happens after death? Where did people come from? All these questions required answers, and the answers were given in the form of myths and legends passed from generation to generation, becoming the basis of the group's culture and identity. The elders were the keepers of knowledge. They remembered the most, knew the stories of the ancestors, knew the rituals, and knew the territory, places to find water in a drought or where game hides. And they were listened to. They were consulted for advice, and their death was the loss not just of a person, but of part of the collective memory. Some scientists believe it was precisely the development of language, the capacity for complex communication, for passing on abstract ideas, and for future planning through discussion that gave Homo sapiens a decisive advantage over Neanderthals and other species. It allowed them to coordinate hunts more effectively, transmit technological innovations faster, and create more complex social structures. Social structure, hierarchies, and equality. The hunter-gatherer groups of that time were largely egalitarian. There was no rigid hierarchy, no kings and slaves, no rich and poor, because there was no property in our sense of the word and no way to accumulate wealth. Surplus food could not be stored for long. Everything obtained was quickly eaten or spoiled. There were differences in status, of course. Good hunters were more respected, as were experienced gatherers, skilled toolmakers, elders, and shamans. But these differences did not translate into power over others, the ability to command or coerce, because every member of the group was needed and everyone made a contribution. Banishment from the group was effectively a death sentence, and killing a group member weakened the entire group. Decisions were made collectively through discussion and consensus. Naturally, the opinions of the experienced and the elders carried more weight, but no one could decide for everyone single-handedly. If someone tried to dominate too obviously or claim more food or rights, the group could put them in their place, ridicule them, or, in extreme cases, exile them. Men and women had different roles. Men mostly hunted, especially large game. Women gathered plant food and cared for the children. But this was not an absolute division. Women could participate in the hunt, especially in botto hunting, where many people were needed to drive the animal, and men helped with gathering and with the children. And there is no evidence that women were oppressed or considered less valuable. In fact, the contribution of women to food procurement was probably greater than that of men, because hunting for large game was not a daily occurrence, while the plant food gathered by women was a more stable, reliable source of calories, and the group depended on them no less, if not more, than on the hunters. Children grew up in an environment where they were surrounded not only by their parents, but by the entire group. All adults cared for the children, protected them, and taught them. And this was an advantage, because if the parents died, which happened quite often, the child did not remain an orphan without care. The group took over the upbringing, and he survived. Learning was through observation, through imitation. Children watched how adults made tools, hunted, gathered food, prepared meals, and gradually began to do the same. First by playing and imitating, then more and more seriously, and by adolescence, they were already full members of the group, capable of making their contribution. Initiations were rituals of transition from childhood to adulthood, especially for boys, who had to prove their courage, their ability to hunt, kill their first large animal, survive pain, hunger, and loneliness. And after successful completion of the initiation, the boy became a man, receiving a new status, new rights, and responsibilities. For girls, initiation was associated with the first menstruation, with the recognition of her ability to become a mother. And the rituals were different, more closed, only for women, where knowledge about childbirth, about raising children, about herbs and plants used for treatment, for contraception, and for pain relief was passed on. Conflicts within the group happened, of course. Jealousy, disputes over partners, over status, over food. But the group tried to resolve them peacefully through the mediation of elders, through rituals of reconciliation, because a split in the group was dangerous for everyone, and maintaining unity was a priority. Between groups, relations were complex. Meetings could be peaceful, when gifts and information were exchanged, when young people found partners from another group to avoid inbreeding, but they could also be hostile, when groups competed for territory or for hunting grounds. And then skirmishes occurred, perhaps even killings. But full-scale wars, as we understand them, probably did not exist, because the groups were too small to wage a war of attrition. Disease, injury, and death were part of life. Life in the Paleolithic was short. The average life expectancy is estimated to have been 20-30 years. Though this is an average figure that includes high infant mortality, and those who survived childhood could live to be 5,060 years old, but there were few such people. Infant mortality was enormous. According to some estimates, up to half of children died before reaching the age of 5 from infections, accidents, animal attacks, or hunger during hard times. And this was the norm, accepted. They grieved, of course, but they understood that this is how life is structured. Diseases were diverse. Infectious diseases, parasites, intestinal infections from contaminated water or raw meat, respiratory diseases especially in cold climates where people lived in smoky caves, inhaling smoke from fires, which led to chronic lung diseases. Malaria was in warm regions, sleeping sickness, transmitted by the tsetse fly in Africa, and many other tropical diseases against which there was no treatment, and an infected person either recovered on their own if their immune system could cope, or died. Injuries on the hunt happen often. A wounded animal could attack, but with its horns, kick with a hoof, or bite, and fractures, lacerations, and internal damage were common occurrences, and without modern medicine, many such injuries were fatal either immediately or a few days later when infection set in. Finds of skeletons of Paleolithic people show traces of trauma, healed fractures, signs of infection on the bones, arthritis in the elderly, dental problems, caries, and abscesses. And it is interesting that they find skeletons of people with serious injuries or diseases, who clearly lived a long time after the trauma, which means they were cared for, fed, and protected until they could care for themselves again. And this is evidence of the compassion and empathy that our ancestors had. One famous find is the skeleton of a Neanderthal from the Shenandoah cave in Iraq, who had multiple injuries, including blindness in one eye, arm damage, and a limp. And he lived many years in such a condition, which is impossible without the help of the group. And this suggests that even Neanderthals, who are often portrayed as crude savages, were capable of caring for the weak. Teeth were a problem because they were worn down from coarse food, from being used as a tool for chewing hides to make them softer, and for holding objects when the hands were busy. And by the age of 3040, the teeth could be worn almost to the gums, and this made eating difficult and led to malnutrition and disease. Death was not taboo. It was seen often. It was part of life, and the attitude toward it was probably more calm and accepting than ours, because it was impossible to avoid it, and impossible to prolong life with medicine or technology. And people knew this and accepted it as an inevitability. Burials were practiced. This we know from archaeological finds. The bodies of the deceased were buried, sometimes in the fetal position, sometimes with grave goods, with tools, with jewelry, with food. And this points to a belief in some form of afterlife, to the idea that death is not the end, but a transition to another state, and the deceased will need things in that other world. Some burials were complex, with ochre red mineral paint that was sprinkled over the body and with flowers. Remains of pollen are found in burials, which indicates that flowers were placed there, perhaps as a symbol of rebirth, spring, and life after death. And all of this is evidence that our ancestors had symbolic thinking, the capacity for abstraction, and for the creation of rituals and myths. Spiritual life, shamanism, and rituals. Religion, as we understand it with temples, priests, and sacred texts, did not exist in the Paleolithic, but a spiritual life certainly did. Without a doubt, there was belief in spirits, in magic, in the connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead, between humans and animals, between nature and the supernatural. Shamanism was likely the primary form of religiosity. A shaman was a person who could communicate with spirits and travel to other worlds through trance, through the use of psychoactive plants, through ritual dances, singing, and drumming. And he was a healer, a diviner, and a mediator between the group and the forces that govern the world. One became a shaman not by choice, but by calling through illness, through a vision, through unusual experiences that marked the person as chosen by the spirits. And then followed a period of training under an old shaman, who passed on knowledge, techniques, and rituals. And only after this could the new shaman practice independently. Cave paintings are sometimes interpreted as being connected to shamanic practices. Some images show figures of half humans, half animals, which may be a depiction of a shaman in a trance when he transforms into an animal spirit, taking its form and its power for a journey to the spirit world. Some caves, especially the deep, hard to reach parts of caves where one must crawl through narrow passages, where it is dark and cold, and where sounds echo off the walls creating eerie acoustics, were likely used for rituals and initiations where young people had to overcome fear, enter the womb of the earth, into the world of the ancestors, and return transformed. Traces of human presence are found in such places. Traces of fires, remnants of torches, handprints on the walls, as if people touched the stone, leaving their mark, saying, "I was here, in this sacred place. I passed through this." And it is touching, because 30,000 years later we can see these prints, touch the same stone, and feel the connection. Animals were not just food, they were spiritual beings. Every species had its own spirit, its own master, and before a hunt, it was necessary to ask for permission, make a sacrifice, and perform a ritual, so that the spirit of the animal would not become angry. and so that the hunt would be successful. And after the kill, it was necessary to give thanks and apologize to the spirit of the slain animal, explaining that the cult of the bear was widespread. The bear was considered a special animal, close to humans, because it could stand on its hind legs, because its skeleton is similar to a human's, and because it was mighty and dangerous. Killing a bear was a feat, and the skull of the bear was kept, revered, and rituals were performed over it. The female statuettes, the Venuses mentioned before, were also possibly objects of a cult of fertility and motherhood, and women prayed to them, asking for help in conception, in childbirth, and in raising healthy children. And this was important because high infant mortality and the complexity of childbirth without medical help made motherhood dangerous and risky. The sun, moon, and stars were observed and revered. They were reference points in time and space. The time of day was determined by the sun, months were counted by the moon, and the lunar cycle was important, especially for women, whose menstrual cycle is often synchronized with the lunar one, and this could be the source of ideas about the connection between the moon and fertility. Eclipses, comets, and meteor showers were frightening and inexplicable events and were interpreted as signs, as warnings from spirits or gods, and after such events, rituals were performed to appease the forces and restore order. The change of seasons, the arrival of spring after winter, was a celebration because it meant the return of life, warmth, and food, and rituals marked this transition, thanking the spirits for surviving the winter and asking for a successful hunt and fertility in the new season. Human beings were not the masters of nature, they were part of it, depended on it completely, and this created an attitude of respect and awe before the forces of nature, before its beauty and its cruelty. And this attitude we have largely lost as we became civilized, when we decided that we could control nature and subject it to ourselves. And now we see the consequences of this pride. The end of the Paleolithic, the beginning of changes. The Paleolithic lasted an incredibly long time, more than 2 million years, and throughout all this time, the way of life of humans changed slowly, almost imperceptibly. Tools became slightly more complex, and hunting techniques slightly more efficient, but fundamentally everything remained the same. People were hunter-gatherers, nomads, lived in small groups, and depended on nature. But about 12,000 years ago, rapid changes began by geological standards. The Ice Age ended, the climate warmed, the glaciers retreated, and the world changed. The savannahs in Africa became wetter, and forests spread in Europe. The sea level rose, flooding coastal territories, and many large animals, the megafauna, went extinct. Mammoths disappeared, as did woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, cave lions, giant sloths in America, and giant kangaroos in Australia. All this went extinct in a relatively short period, and the reasons are debated. Was it climate change, or hunting by humans who became too effective as predators, or a combination of both factors? Humans likely played a role, especially in the extinction of megafauna in America and Australia, where Homo sapiens arrived late, about 1,500,020,000 years ago in America, and about 5,060,000 years ago in Australia. The animals there were not adapted to such an effective predator. They did not fear humans, and were easily killed, and populations were destroyed quickly. With the disappearance of large animals, people had to adapt, hunting smaller game and engaging more in gathering and fishing. In some places, especially in the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent, the domestication of plants and animals began, which was the start of the Neolithic revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to farming and animal husbandry. This was a slow process, stretched over millennia. People did not suddenly decide to become farmers. They gradually began to plant the seeds of the plants they gathered. They noticed that new plants grow from seeds, began to care for them, selected the best ones, and over time wild plants turned into cultivated ones, wheat and barley, which became the basis of agriculture. Animals also began to be domesticated. First dogs, which had already lived near humans for a long time and were semi-domesticated. Then sheep, goats, pigs, and cows. These animals provided not only meat, but also milk, wool, and draft power. This changed the economy and lifestyle, allowing for the accumulation of surpluses and the support of larger populations. With agriculture came sedentarism. People no longer roamed, because they needed to stay near the fields, protect the harvest, and care for it. The first permanent settlements appeared: villages, then cities, and with cities came civilizations, writing, and the state. Everything that we consider history. But that was already after the Paleolithic. That was the Mesolithic, a transitional period. Then the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And further on, the history that we know from written sources, monuments, and artifacts of later civilizations. The Paleolithic ended. The hunter-gatherer way of life gradually disappeared across most of the planet, remaining only in remote places among a few peoples. And the world changed forever. It became the world we live in now, world of cities, technology, and globalization. But that is a different story. What can we understand from the Paleolithic? What is important for us now? The Paleolithic is more than 90% of human history, if counting from the appearance of the first Homo. It is a vast period during which our biology, our psychology, and our instincts were formed. And understanding how our ancestors lived helps us understand why we are the way we are, why we behave this way and not otherwise. We evolved for the life of hunter-gatherers, for life in small groups, for constant movement, for a diverse diet, and for a close connection with nature. And the modern lifestyle, especially in cities, sedentary work, processed food, isolation from nature, huge anonymous societies, all of this contradicts our biology. Many modern problems, obesity, depression, anxiety, chronic diseases may be linked to this mismatch. Our brain is tuned to certain stimuli, to dangers that no longer exist, to the social dynamics of small groups where everyone knows each other. And when we live in metropolises, surrounded by millions of strangers, our brain does not understand how to cope with this and experiences stress and anxiety. Because evolutionarily we are not adapted to such an environment. Understanding this does not mean we need to return to caves. That is impossible and unnecessary. Civilization has given us enormous advantages: medicine, technology, comfort, and knowledge. But it means we need to be aware of our biological roots and try to adapt modern life, so that it corresponds more to our nature. Move more, because our body is built for movement, for walking, running, and climbing, and not for sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day. Spend time in nature, because contact with nature reduces stress and improves mood. This has been proven by research. Maintain close relationships with a small group of people, family, friends, because it is precisely such relationships that provide a sense of belonging, support, and security. Eat a variety of foods, not too processed, because our organism is adapted to a diet of meat, fish, vegetables, fruits, and nuts, and not to refined carbohydrates, trans fats, and chemical additives, which are plentiful in modern food and cause inflammation, metabolic disorders, and diseases. Sleep enough in the dark, because our circadian rhythm is tuned to the natural cycle of day and night. Artificial lighting and the screens we look at until late at night disrupt this rhythm, and worsen sleep quality, which affects everything: mood, health, and cognitive functions. And another thing that is important is the understanding that we are not separate from nature, not its masters. We are part of it and dependent on it. And the destruction of nature occurring now is the destruction of the foundation of our existence. This is not a metaphor, it is literally so. Without a stable climate, without biodiversity, and without clean water and air, we will not survive. Civilization will not survive. Our ancestors knew this intuitively. They lived in harmony with nature, not because they were saints or ecologically conscious, but because they had no choice. They took only what they needed because they could not carry more or preserve it. The population was small, and the impact on nature was minimal. We lost this connection, this harmony, when we became civilized, when we learned to accumulate, control, and exploit. And now we see the consequences. The climate crisis, the extinction of species, pollution, and the degradation of ecosystems. If we do not change course, if we do not bring back at least a little of that respect for nature that our ancestors had, we risk losing everything. So the study of the Paleolithic is not just an academic interest, not just curiosity about the past. It is a lesson for the present and the future, reminder of who we are, where we came from, what we need for happiness and health, and what the price is for our detachment from our roots, from nature, and from the conditions in which we evolved for millions of years. The world of the Paleolithic was cruel, dangerous, and full of suffering and death, and no one in their right mind would want to return there. But there is also something in it that we have lost: simplicity, spontaneity, a connection with others, with nature, and with the present moment. And perhaps we can find a way to bring at least a part of that back into our lives, without giving up the benefits of civilization, but supplementing them, making life more complete, more human, and more in line with our nature, which remains Paleolithic at its core despite all our technologies and achievements. Technologies change slowly, but they changed everything. If we look at the speed of technological progress in the Paleolithic, it will seem incredibly slow to us, almost standing still, because the same types of tools were used for hundreds of thousands of years without much change. Old and chopper simple stones with a sharp edge existed in practically unchanged form from 2.5 million years ago until about 1.5 million years ago. Only then did hand axes appear, more complex symmetrical tools, but they, too, were then used for more than 1 million years almost without change. Compare this with our time, when technologies change every few years. When a phone bought 5 years ago seems obsolete, when computers, programs, and applications are updated constantly, and you will understand how different time was in the Paleolithic, how much slower history flowed. This is not because our ancestors were stupider or lazier, but because living conditions change slowly. If a tool worked, if it performed its function, why change it? Why invent something new when the old one handles it perfectly? Innovations occurred when necessity arose, when the climate changed, when familiar prey disappeared, and it was necessary to hunt other animals requiring different techniques, or when people migrated to new regions with different conditions where old methods did not work. That is when new tools, new strategies, and new solutions appeared, and those groups that could adapt, invent, and learn survived, while those who could not died out. This was natural selection, not only at the biological level, but also at the cultural level. One of the most important technological achievements of the Paleolithic was the invention of the spear with a stone tip. This sounds simple, but it was a revolution, because earlier spears were just sharpened sticks that were charred over a fire to make them harder. But they broke quickly and could not pierce the thick hide of a large animal. A spear with a stone tip was much more effective. It could inflict a deep wound and could kill a large animal if it hit the right place, the heart, lungs, or large vessels. Making such a spear required several stages. First, one had to find a suitable stone, usually flint or obsidian, hard rocks that split well, creating sharp edges. Then the stone had to be processed to give it the shape of a tip, long, triangular, or leaf-shaped with a sharp point and cutting edges. This required dozens or hundreds of strikes, precise and controlled, and not everyone could do it. It was a craft that required training and practice. Then one had to find or make a shaft, a straight branch or a young tree, clean it of bark, dry it, straighten it over a fire if necessary, sharpen one end, make a split where the tip was inserted, and secure the tip by wrapping it with tendons or plant fibers, coating it with resin or boiled glue made from animal hooves so it would hold firmly and not fall out upon impact. Such a spear was a complex composite tool, and its creation required planning, an understanding of the properties of different materials, and the ability to work with them. This is evidence that the brains of our ancestors were capable of abstract thinking, understanding cause and effect relationships, and planning for the future. Because time passed between the start of making the spear and its use, sometimes days, and it was necessary to keep the ultimate goal in mind, not get distracted, and see the work through to the end. Another important invention is the spear thrower, the atlatl, as it is called. A simple device, but incredibly effective. It was a stick or a small board with a hook at the end on which the spear was placed. One held the other end of the atlatl and threw the spear using the atlatl as an extension of the arm, as a lever that increased the speed and range of the throw several times over. With a spear thrower, one could throw a spear 5,070 meters, maybe even further if you were an experienced thrower. This gave an enormous advantage in the hunt, because one could attack an animal at a distance, without approaching closely, where it could kill or wound you. Group hunting with spear throwers was very effective. Several hunters could pelt an animal with spears from a distance. Inflicting multiple wounds, the animal would weaken and fall, and it could be finished off safely. Spear throwers appeared relatively late in the Paleolithic, about 2,030,000 years ago, and their appearance is associated with the Upper Paleolithic, that time, when Homo sapiens had already spread across most of the planet, and began creating more complex specialized tools, more diverse and adapted to specific tasks and conditions. The bow and arrow appeared even later, perhaps 1,500,020,000 years ago. Exact dates are unknown because wood is not preserved, but stone arrowheads are found small, light, clearly intended for arrows and not for spears. This was another revolution, because the bow allowed for rapid firing. Several arrows per minute allowed for hunting small, fast game like birds and rabbits that a spear could not reach, and provided additional distance and even greater safety for the hunter. All these technologies, spears, spear throwers, bows, made humans increasingly effective predators, more and more dangerous for animals. And this is one of the reasons why megafauna began to go extinct, because animals had evolved for millions of years in a world where there was no predator, like the human, with long-range weapons, with group coordination, with fire. And they did not know how to protect themselves from this. They did not fear humans, until it was too late. Fire changes everything, from survival to culture. Control over fire was probably the most important technological achievement in all of human history. More important than the wheel, more important than writing, more important than the internet. Because fire gave people the opportunity to survive in a climate where, without fire, they would have died. It gave them the ability to cook food, which changed nutrition, physiology, and brain development. It provided light, protection, and a social space around the campfire where the group gathered, communicated, and created culture. When exactly people began to use fire is a question to which there is no exact answer. The earliest undisputed evidence of the use of fire dates back about 1 million years, maybe a bit earlier. Finds in Africa and Asia reveal hearths, traces of burning, and charred bones. But could people have used fire earlier? It is possible. The traces simply have not been preserved, or we have not found them, because fire in the open air does not leave long-lasting traces. Ashes scattered by the wind, stones blackened by fire can be the result of natural fires, and it is difficult to distinguish them. But by the period when Homo erectus migrated to Europe and Asia, to colder regions, about 800,000 or perhaps 1 million years ago, control over fire was already mandatory, because it was impossible to survive the winter there without fire. And finds in Europe show that fire was used regularly. In caves, there are layers of ash, charcoal, and charred bones, testifying to the fact that fire burned there constantly and was maintained for a long time. Initially, people did not know how to start a fire. They found it when lightning struck a tree, or when a forest or steppe fire began, and they took glowing embers or branches that were still burning and carried them to their place, carefully guarding them, not letting them go out, and maintained this fire, feeding it with dry grass, branches, and bones. Later, much later, people learned to start a fire themselves by friction, rotating a stick in a hole on a piece of wood quickly, for a long time, until the wood dust began to smolder from the friction, and then it was necessary to blow on it. Add tinder dry moss or grass, and a flame appeared, or by striking sparks, hitting flint against iron pyrite. Sparks fell onto the tinder, and, with luck, the tinder began to smolder, and the fire could be fanned. But both of these methods required effort, time, and skills, and were not always successful, especially in damp weather when everything is wet and the tinder does not want to ignite. Therefore, even when they learned to produce fire, they preferred to maintain it constantly, not to extinguish it. It was simpler, more reliable, and the fire in the hearth was a symbol of home, safety, and community, a place where the family or group gathered. And as long as the fire burned, everything was fine. Life continued. Cooking food over fire changed human biology. This is not an exaggeration. Raw meat is difficult to chew and difficult to digest. The body spends a lot of energy on digestion, while cooked meat is softer, easier to chew, easier to digest, and the body receives more calories and more nutrients from the same amount of food. And this additional energy could go toward the development of the brain, which requires an enormous amount of energy, about 20% of all the calories the body consumes, although the brain makes up only 2% of the body's mass. Some scientists believe that it was precisely the transition to cooking food that allowed the brain to grow, increase in size, and become more complex. And indeed, in Homo erectus, who began to use fire regularly, the brain was larger than in earlier species, and in Homo sapiens, the brain is even larger. Although it is interesting that in the last tens of thousands of years, the human brain has slightly decreased, not significantly, but noticeably, and the reasons for this are debated. Perhaps with the development of agriculture and civilization, such a large brain was no longer needed. Perhaps nutrition changed, becoming less diverse and worse in quality. Or perhaps it is simply natural variation, and there is nothing terrible about it. Cooking also killed parasites, bacteria, and pathogens in meat that could cause disease and poisoning. And this reduced morbidity and increased the chances of survival, especially for children, who are more vulnerable to infections, and for pregnant women, who need many nutrients for carrying a child. Fire also allowed for the expansion of the diet, making things edible that cannot be eaten raw. For example, some tubers and root vegetables contain toxins, or are simply too tough to be eaten raw. But cooked, boiled, or baked, they became soft, tasty, and nutritious. And this provided additional sources of food, especially in seasons when meat was scarce. When hunting was unsuccessful, one could rely on plant food prepared over a fire. Light from fire was psychologically important. A dark night in the wild is full of fears, uncertainty, and dangers that are not seen but are felt. Rustles, sounds, animal eyes glowing in the dark, all of this causes primal fear, and fire chased away this fear, creating a circle of light and safety where one could see each other, where one could relax and talk. And this was important for mental health and for the social cohesion of the group. Communication took place around the fire. Stories were told, knowledge was passed on. And this was education in that world. There were no schools, teachers, or textbooks. There was only the oral word, observation, and imitation. And children learned by listening to adults, watching how they made tools, how they prepared food, how they processed hides, and gradually absorbed the knowledge they would need for survival. The campfire was also the place where rituals were performed, where the shaman entered a trance and communicated with spirits, where successful hunts were celebrated, where the dead were mourned, where the young underwent initiations and became adult members of the group. And fire was a witness to all of this. The center of life, a symbol of home, and not for nothing in many cultures. Even now, the hearth, the home fire, has special meaning. It is not just a practical device for cooking. It is a symbol of family, home, and the continuity of life. Settling the planet was an incredible feat. If you think about how people spread across the entire planet from Africa to Asia, Europe, Australia, and America, it seems like an incredible achievement, especially considering that they had no maps, compasses, GPS, or transport other than their own legs, and they went on foot for generations, covering thousands of kilometers, crossing mountains and deserts, crossing rivers and seas, and survived in completely new, unfamiliar environments where everything was different: animals, plants, climate, and they had to learn all over again, adapt, and invent new ways of survival. The migration to Australia was particularly amazing because even during the Ice Age, when the sea level was lower, Australia was not connected to Asia by a land bridge. It was necessary to cross open water several dozen, maybe 100 kilometers. And this means that people must have had some kind of watercraft, boats or rafts. And this is very early evidence of seafaring, because people came to Australia about 5,060,000 years ago. This is much earlier than the first known boats appeared in other parts of the world. How they crossed the water, we do not know. Perhaps they were simple rafts made of tied logs, perhaps boats hollowed out from tree trunks. Perhaps they just held onto floating logs and swam, risking their lives. But somehow they crossed, and not just once. Because the population of Australia must have started with a sufficient number of people to avoid inbreeding and degeneration. That means there were several crossings, or a large group crossed at once. In Australia, they met a completely unique fauna: kangaroos, wombats, koalas, platypuses, and many other animals that are found nowhere else, and also giant animals. Megafauna: giant kangaroos 3 meters tall, giant wombats the size of a cow, huge flightless birds, and predatory kangaroos with claws. And all these animals did not fear humans because they had never seen them, and this made them easy prey. Within a few thousand years, maybe even faster, most of the Australian megafauna went extinct and disappeared. And the reason, most likely, was hunting, because the climate in Australia did not change as dramatically as in other parts of the world, and the only new thing that appeared was people. And shortly after their appearance, extinctions began. This is not a coincidence. It is a cause and effect relationship that is hard to ignore. The Aborigines of Australia lived there in isolation for tens of thousands of years, until the arrival of Europeans in the 18th century, and during this time, they developed a unique culture, language, or rather, many languages, hundreds of different language groups, art, music, and spiritual beliefs connected with the land, the landscape, and animals, and their knowledge of nature was profound. They knew every plant, every animal, every source of water in their territories, which were vast, and survived in one of the harshest environments on the planet, in the Australian deserts, where the temperature in summer exceeds 50 degrees, where there is almost no water, where one needs to know how to find it and how to survive. The migration to America occurred later, across Beringer, the land bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska during the Ice Age when the sea level was low, and people, following animals, herds of mammoths, bison, and reindeer that migrated across this bridge also crossed, probably not realizing they were moving to a new continent. For them, it was just a new territory where game grazed, where they could hunt. Exact dates are debated. Traditionally, it was believed that people came to America about 15,000 years ago. This is the so-called Clovis culture, named after a site in New Mexico where characteristic stone points were found. But recent finds show that people could have been in America earlier, maybe 20, 25, or even 30,000 years ago. Although this is controversial, and not all scientists agree with these dates, be that as it may, by the end of the Ice Age, about 1,200,000,000 10,000 years ago, people had already settled across both Americas, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. And this settlement was rapid, perhaps a few thousand years, which is very little on a geological scale. And they settled in an incredible variety of environments, from the Arctic tundra to the Amazonian jungle, from the high altitudes of the Andes to the coastal plains. In America, they also met megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of an elephant, giant armadillos, saber-toothed cats, American lions, and camels. Yes, there were camels and horses in America. The ancestors of modern horses evolved in America, although they later went extinct there and survived only in Asia, from where they were reintroduced by the Spanish in the 15th century. And again, shortly after the arrival of humans, a mass extinction of megafauna began. Within a few thousand years, most of the large animals disappeared, and once more, most likely because of hunting, since these animals did not know humans, did not fear them, and had no defensive mechanisms against such a predator. The populations were destroyed quickly, having no time to adapt. This is a sad pattern that repeated itself over and over. Wherever humans arrived, the megafauna began to die out. Only in Africa and partially in Asia, where humans evolved alongside these animals, and where the animals had millions of years to learn to fear and avoid humans, did the megafauna partially survive. Elephants, rhinos, hippos, giraffes, and big cats. But even there, many species vanished, and populations were greatly reduced due to hunting and environmental changes caused by humans using fire to alter the landscape, burning down forests and creating savannas, where it was easier to hunt. The relationship with nature was complex and dualistic. The modern romantic picture of primitive people living in harmony with nature, not exploiting it, and taking only what they need, is largely a myth and idealization that does not fit the facts. Paleolithic humans significantly impacted nature. They hunted until populations were exhausted, caused extinctions, altered landscapes with fire. And they did this not because they were cruel or irresponsible, but because they did not understand the consequences. They did not know that their actions could lead to the disappearance of species or the degradation of ecosystems. For them, nature was inexhaustible and infinite. If animals became fewer in one place, they could move to another place where there were still many. And that is what they did, roaming and following the prey. And when the prey disappeared entirely, like the mammoths and many other megafauna species, they adapted, switching to other prey, to smaller animals, to fish, to plant food. And they survived because they were flexible and capable of adaptation. But this does not mean they were bad, or that we should judge them. They did what seemed necessary for survival. In a world where survival was difficult, where every day was a struggle, where there were no surpluses, and where hunger was a real threat, they could not afford the luxury of thinking about long-term consequences, species preservation, or ecosystem balance. These concepts simply did not exist. There was no intellectual framework for them to understand them. On the other hand, they possessed a deep knowledge of nature and intimate, practical knowledge that we have lost. They knew animal behavior, their habits, and seasonal migrations. They knew plants which were edible, which were medicinal, and which were poisonous. They knew the weather and could predict changes by observing the clouds, the wind, and animal behavior. And this knowledge was a matter of life and death. It was passed down through generations, preserved in myths, stories, and songs, and was incredibly valuable. They also had a spiritual relationship with nature, belief that animals, plants, rivers, and mountains had spirits, that everything was connected, and that one must respect nature, ask for permission, and give thanks. And these beliefs, although they did not prevent extinction and degradation, created a certain ethical framework and a certain restraint, because killing an animal was not just a practical act of obtaining food, it was also a spiritual act, requiring ritual and gratitude. And this, perhaps, limited the scale of the killing and made people more cautious and more respectful, though certainly not always. And many animals were exterminated anyway. We, modern humans, have lost both the practical knowledge of nature and the spiritual connection to it. For most of us, nature is something distant that we see on television or in parks, something that exists separately from us, and we do not understand how much we depend on it. on clean water, air, a stable climate, and biodiversity. And our impact on nature now is much greater and much more destructive than that of Paleolithic humans, because there are billions of us, and because we have technologies that allow us to change the planet on scales that were previously impossible. Yet, at the same time, we have neither the knowledge nor the respect that our ancestors had, and we pay a price for this, seeing the consequences in climate change, the extinction of species, and the degradation of ecosystems. And if we do not change, if we do not bring back at least a part of that respect and understanding our ancestors had, we risk destroying the foundation of our own existence. And this is not an exaggeration, it is the reality we face now. Water was a source of life and danger at the same time. Rivers, lakes, and springs were centers of life in the Paleolithic. Both animals and humans concentrated around them, because water is the basis of everything. Without it, nothing survives. And where there is water, there are plants, animals come to drink. And there you can hunt, gather, and catch fish, if there are any. Therefore, human campsites were usually located not far from water, within a day's trek, so that one could come every day, collect water, and observe the animals. But water was also dangerous. Rivers could overflow during rains, flooding campsites and washing away everything people had, their dwellings, supplies, and tools. And it was necessary to choose a place close to the water, but not too close on high ground, where the flood would not reach, while still having a good vantage point to see the surroundings and approaching dangers from animals or other people. Dangerous creatures lived in the water, like crocodiles, as already mentioned. They were a real threat. Silent, patient predators that could wait for hours, motionless in the water like logs, and when the prey approached for a drink, attack instantly with a speed hard to imagine for such a large, heavy animal. Seize it with powerful jaws, drag it underwater, and resistance was useless because the crocodile's strength is enormous, and if it caught you, it almost certainly killed you. Humans learned to be cautious near water, not to approach the edge too closely, not to go alone, especially at dawn and dusk when crocodiles are most active. Collect water quickly, do not linger, and do not swim if there is a risk. And these rules were passed from elders to youngsters, and those who ignored them could pay with their lives. And such cases, of course, occurred, and the group would lose a member. This was a tragedy because every person was valuable and almost irreplaceable in such a small group. Hippos, which were already mentioned, were also connected to the water, and they were perhaps even more dangerous than crocodiles, because a crocodile usually attacks to eat, but a hippo attacks to protect territory, protect its young, or simply because it is irritated. And it does not eat the person after killing them. It just kills, tramples, bites with huge tusks, and leaves the body. This makes it especially terrifying because you cannot predict when it will attack. It can be calm, and a second later be enraged and attack with incredible speed despite its weight of 2 to 3 tons. Water from rivers and lakes was not always clean, especially in stagnant bodies of water, in puddles left after rains. Bacteria, parasites, and protozoa multiplied there, causing diseases, diarrhea, dysentery, and cholera. And drinking such water was dangerous. But often there was no choice, especially in a drought when no clean water remained, and people drank what was there, and got sick, and many died from these diseases, especially children and the elderly, whose immune systems were weaker. Some groups, perhaps, learned to prefer running water over stagnant water because they noticed that they got sick less, often from running water, although they did not understand why. They did not know about bacteria and parasites. It was just a practical observation that worked and was passed on, as a rule, as part of the knowledge for survival. Fishing was an important source of food, especially for groups living near rivers, lakes, and seas. Fish was rich in protein and fats, especially oily fish like salmon, which went upstream to spawn in huge schools, and at this time, It could be caught in enormous quantities, almost with bare hands. Because the rivers were full of fish, it moved densely, almost shoulder to shoulder, and you could just scoop it up or hit it with spears. And this was a feast, a time of abundance when one could eat their fill, stock up for the future, smoke, and dry fish in the sun and smoke. And these supplies helped survive difficult times. But such fish was not everywhere. In tropical rivers, for example, in Africa, there was less fish. It was more diverse, smaller, and harder to catch. Nets, traps, and harpoons were needed, and this required technologies that did not appear immediately but gradually. With the development of skills and the transmission of knowledge, shellfish and crustaceans on the coasts were accessible. Oysters, mussels, crabs, and they were nutritious and easily gathered during low tides when the sea receded, leaving stones and sand exposed and strewn with edible creatures. Groups living on the coasts actively used these resources. Archaeologists find huge piles of shells, so-called shell middens or kitchen middens, near ancient campsites, evidence that seafood was an important part of the diet. Some scientists believe that it was precisely the access to seafood, rich in omega-3 fatty acids vital for brain development, that contributed to the evolution of human intelligence. Because groups living by the coasts and rivers rich in fish had higher quality nutrition and more nutrients necessary for brain growth and function, and this gave them an advantage. Though, of course, this is only one of the theories, and not everyone agrees with it. The seasons dictated the rhythm of life completely. In the Paleolithic, there were no calendars, clocks, or schedules. Life flowed according to natural cycles, the seasons, and the movement of the sun and moon. And people were deeply tuned to these cycles. They knew them intuitively, felt the changes, and prepared for them in advance because survival depended on it. Spring was a time of renewal and rebirth. After a long winter when food was scarce, when one had to live on supplies and what could be found in or under the snow, spring brought warmth and light, and life exploded. Plants began to grow. The first green shoots and flowers appeared, and herbivores also began to reproduce and give birth. And this was a time when food became more plentiful, when one could hunt young animals that had not yet learned caution, and when one could gather young plants tender, tasty, and full of vitamins that were so lacking in winter. Humans who survived the winter were often exhausted and weakened, and spring was a time for recovery and gaining strength. Not everyone lived until spring, especially the elderly, children, and the sick. Winter was a process of natural selection, harsh and merciless, and those who survived were the strongest or the luckiest. Summer was a time of abundance, at least in regions with a favorable climate. Vegetation was lush, animals were healthy and fat, game was diverse and accessible, and groups could eat their fill, gain weight, and store body fat, which would help survive the winter. This was important because fat is energy, it is insulation, and it is protection against cold and hunger. In summer, they also gathered and stored food for the winter. They dried meat, making something like jerky that could be stored for months without spoiling. They gathered nuts and seeds that could be kept for a long time. They dug up and dried root vegetables. These supplies were hidden in cool, dry places, in caves, or in pits dug into the earth, and they hoped they would be preserved, that animals would not find or eat them, and that they would not get moldy or rot. Autumn was a time of preparation for winter, the last chance to stock up, the last time when hunting was still relatively easy, because the animals were also preparing for winter, putting on fat, and were slower, less cautious, and busy eating the last food supplies before the cold. The leaves on the trees changed color, turned yellow, red, and fell. This was the signal that winter was near, that one needed to check the supplies, check the shelters, and make sure they were protected from the wind and snow, and that there was enough wood and fuel for the fire that would burn all winter without stopping. Because fire is life in wintertime. Without it, death would come quickly. Winter was the hardest time, especially in northern regions in Europe and Asia where snow lay for months. where the temperature dropped to extreme levels, where the daylight was short only a few hours and most of the time it was dark and cold, and leaving the shelter was dangerous, not only because of the cold, but also because visibility was poor, orientation was difficult, and one could get lost, freeze, or fail to find the way back. Hunting in winter was arduous. Animals hid, migrated to warmer places, or hibernated like the bear, and finding prey was complicated. One had to know where to look and follow tracks in the snow, which required skill, patience, and luck. Often the hunt was unsuccessful, and the group lived on supplies, economizing food, eating less, and waiting for spring, counting the days. Although they did not know how to count in our sense, they felt that the winter had already lasted a long time, and that it should soon become warmer. Hunger in winter was a reality, a frequent reality when supplies ran out before spring arrived, and then they had to go out, look for anything at all, gnaw the bark of trees, and dig into the frozen ground in search of roots that might have been preserved. People grew weak and sick, and some died. This was accepted as an inevitability, as a part of life. No one was to blame. The winter was simply too long, too harsh, and not everyone could survive. The change of seasons was observed and marked not in writing, of course, but through rituals, through the observation of the sun, the stars, the moon, and the behavior of animals and plants. This knowledge was vital because it allowed for prediction, planning, and preparation. Groups that better understood these cycles had a better chance of survival. This knowledge was precious, passed down carefully and with respect from elders to the youth, and was the foundation of survival. Children grew up fast because they had to. Childhood in the Paleolithic was short, not in the sense that children matured faster physiologically, but in the sense that they were expected to quickly become useful members of the group, to contribute, and to help. Already from the age of 56, children began to perform simple tasks, gathering brushwood for the fire, helping women gather plants, carrying things, and looking after younger children. This was learning by doing, through participation in the life of the group. Children's play was not just entertainment, it was preparation for adult life. Boys played at hunting, throwing small spears at targets, learning to hit accurately, learning to stalk and sneak up unnoticed. It was fun, but it was also training. Adults encouraged these games, praised successes, taught them, and showed them how to properly hold a spear, how to throw, and how to move. Girls played at gathering plants and caring for infants, using dolls made of grass or branches wrapped in leaves. They learned to carry children in their arms, and on their backs they learned patience, because caring for children requires endless patience. Adult women taught them which plants were edible, how to process them, and how to cook. This knowledge was critically important because women were the primary providers of plant food, which made up the bulk of the diet. Physically, children in the Paleolithic were likely stronger and more resilient than modern children because they were constantly moving, climbing, running, and helping adults. There was no sitting for hours at a desk or in front of a screen. Their bodies developed naturally through movement and physical activity, which made them strong and agile. Those who were weaker or slower had less chance of survival, because in the Paleolithic world, there was no place for the weak. It sounds cruel, but it was reality. The attachment between parents and children was, of course, strong and deep, as it is in all mammals. Mothers protected their children at the cost of their own lives. There are cases where the remains of women are found embracing children, buried together. It is touching. It shows that love and attachment are not inventions of civilization. They are basic emotions that our ancestors possessed perhaps even more strongly than we do. Because in a world where death was a constant threat, where a child could be lost at any moment, every moment together was valuable, and the bond was intense. Breastfeeding lasted a long time, up to 34 years and sometimes longer, because there were no alternatives, no cow's milk, no formulas, and breast milk was the only food for infants. Even after children began eating solid food, they continued to nurse, which gave them additional nutrition and protection, because breast milk contains antibodies that protect against disease. Long-term breastfeeding also served as a natural contraceptive, because while a woman is nursing, her fertility is reduced and pregnancy is less likely. This was important because having too many children at once was dangerous. It was difficult to care for several small children at the same time, to carry them, feed them, and protect them. An interval of 34 years between children was probably optimal, allowing the previous child to grow and become more independent before the next appeared. Infant mortality was high. This bears repeating, but it is important to understand the scale. Half or more of children did not live to age 5. This meant that every woman had to give birth to many children, so that at least a few would survive and reach adulthood. This was physically taxing and exhausting, and many women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. This was one of the main causes of death for women of childbearing age. Fathers were also involved in raising children, not to the same extent as mothers, of course, but they played with the children, taught the boys to hunt, and protected the family. In some cultures, even in the Paleolithic, the father's role was significant, not just a genetic donor, but an active participant in the children's lives. This was an advantage for the children's survival, because the more adults cared for a child, the higher their chances. Old age was a rarity, but the elderly were valuable. Living to old age in the Paleolithic was an achievement. Few lived to be 5,060 years old. Those who did were rare, unique individuals, and they were valued and respected, not only because they survived, which was a feat in itself, but because they were the keepers of knowledge, memory, and experience accumulated over decades. The elderly remembered events that occurred 30, 40, or 50 years ago. They remembered where there had been a terrible drought or a flood. They remembered places where water could be found in the most difficult times. They remembered which plants saved them from hunger when everything else was unavailable. This knowledge was priceless. It could save the group in a critical situation. They also remembered the stories, myths, and rituals. They knew the songs sung at ceremonies. They knew how to properly conduct initiations, and how to communicate with spirits. This made them spiritual leaders and guardians of tradition, and their word carried weight. They were listened to and consulted for advice. Physically, the elderly were weaker. Of course, they could not hunt or walk long distances. Their teeth were worn down, their bones ached. Arthritis, which is found in many skeletons of elderly Paleolithic people, made movement painful, and they could not make the same physical contribution as the young. But their contribution was different: intellectual, spiritual, and cultural. Groups cared for the elderly, fed them, and protected them. This is evidence that social support existed in the Paleolithic, that people did not abandon those who could no longer work but cared for them. This was not pure altruism. It was practical because the elderly were useful. It was also an investment in the future because the young, seeing the care for the elderly, knew that when they grew old, they too would be cared for. This created a social contract, a system of mutual support that strengthened the group. However, not all elderly lived to a natural death. Some, when they became too weak or too sick, when they became a burden to the group, especially in hard times when food was scarce, might be left behind or abandoned. This was a tragic but sometimes necessary measure. When the group's survival depended on the ability to move quickly, and an elder who could not walk slowed everyone down, the decision made was cruel but rational, and the elder might understand this and accept it, knowing they had lived their life, and that it was now the turn of the youth. Some left on their own, distancing themselves from the group and finding a quiet place to die alone. This was an act of self-sacrifice, an act of love for the group. This, too, was a part of life, a part of the cycle. Injuries and how they were managed without modern medicine. Medicine in the modern sense did not exist. Of course, there were no doctors, hospitals, medications, antibiotics, or anesthesia. But this does not mean there was no care for the sick and wounded, or no attempts to treat and alleviate suffering. Archaeological finds show that Paleolithic people possessed some knowledge of treating injuries, and plants that could help. Bone fractures were treated. We know this because we find skeletons with fractures that healed, and healed correctly, indicating that someone immobilized the bone, applying something like a splint to keep the bone in place while it knit. This requires the understanding that the bone must be kept still, and that time is needed for healing. A person with a fracture could not hunt or work, and the group had to care for them, feed them, and protect them for months until they recovered. Wounds were washed with water, and perhaps cauterized with fire to stop bleeding and kill infection. Although they did not understand the concept of infection, or know about bacteria, they saw that wounds that were dirty became festered, while clean wounds healed better. This practical observation led to attempts to keep wounds clean, wash them, and perhaps apply certain plants noticed to aid healing. Some plants truly have antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties, perhaps through observation, experimentation, and the transmission of knowledge. Paleolithic people knew about some of them and used them. This was the beginning of pharmacology, albeit very primitive, based not on an understanding of chemistry or biology, but on practical experience and what worked. Pain was a constant companion, especially for those who suffered injuries or for the elderly with arthritis. Managing pain was difficult. There were no painkillers, and people endured, clenching their teeth, or used psychoactive plants if they knew of them. Plants that alter consciousness, dull pain, and provide euphoria or trance. Such plants were known in many cultures, used by shamans, and perhaps also for the relief of physical pain.